We all fear natural disasters that occur suddenly and whose destructive power wipes out everything in their path. But sometimes, the cause of terrifying tragedies with a massive number of victims is not nature but humans themselves. In this video, I invite you to learn the details and reasons behind 5 horrifying man-made disasters of the 20th century. On June 4, 1989, at 1:14 a.m. local time, the deadliest train disaster in the history of the Soviet Union and modern Russia occurred on the border of Bashkortostan and the Chelyabinsk region, near the city of Ufa. This tragedy claimed the lives of between 500 and 700 people. That night, 2 passenger trains were traveling parallel to each other. Train number 211, Novosibirsk-Adler, and train number 212, Adler-Novosibirsk, about 15 kilometers from the city of Asha. Since it was summer, both trains were fully loaded. Passengers in one train were returning home with their families from a vacation, while the other train was taking travelers to the sea for their holidays. At the moment the 2 trains passed each other, a massive explosion occurred due to a gas leak from a nearby main pipeline. The explosion ignited a fire that engulfed 250 hectares of forest, but the most devastating impact was on the trains. The shockwave derailed the rear cars of both trains, sending 6 of them down an embankment and ripping the roofs off 2 cars, flinging them 50 meters away. Windows shattered in every car, exposing the sleeping passengers to the flames. Survivors described a nightmarish scene, burning train cars with people trapped inside, with little to no chance of escape. The intense blast caused upper bunks to collapse, severely injuring the passengers below and blocking their exit routes. Those on board experienced a living hell, unable to help their loved ones dying before their eyes. Forensic experts who arrived at the scene were horrified by what they saw. Inside the train cars, everything combustible had been consumed by the flames. Even metal handles in the compartments had melted. Later examinations revealed that temperatures inside the cars reached 1,200 degrees Celsius and remained at that level for 10 minutes. The first responders to help the victims were residents of the village of Srednye Kazyaki. That night, they woke to the sound of the explosion and shattering windows. When they went outside to investigate, they saw a massive glow and an enormous cloud of smoke. According to eyewitnesses, the flames rose over 200 meters into the sky. Some villagers made their way to the fire, where they found charred train cars and burning passengers. Compassionate onlookers called emergency services and began helping the injured, taking them into their homes. Train driver Sergei Stolyarov of train number 2412 also played a crucial role in rescuing survivors. While traveling from the Ulu-Telyak station, he noticed the power to the contact network had been cut and saw a bright glow in the distance. Minutes later, he encountered 2 severely burned individuals who informed him about the tragedy. Stolyarov decoupled his train and, using the locomotive's reserve power, traveled to the disaster site. That night, he made 3 trips between the site and the station, transporting over 300 people, both survivors and the deceased. An hour after the explosion, rescuers, medics, and law enforcement were actively working at the site. A firefighting train arrived, and by 5 a.m., police and KGB officers began searching the forest for survivors who had fled in shock. On the first day alone, 150 people were found alive in the woods. Efforts to assist the victims and extinguish the fire were carried out with full responsibility, saving many lives. But what caused the explosion that claimed hundreds of lives? Initially, a terrorist act was suspected, as the blast coincided with the meeting of 2 passenger trains heading to resort destinations. However, the investigation later uncovered a different cause. A teacher from Ufa played a key role in the investigation. On June 3rd, she and her class were camping in the forest a few kilometers from the railway. According to her, 10 minutes before the explosion, she heard a strange rumbling noise, similar to that of a jet engine coming from the direction of Snake Mountain, Zamaynaya Gora. Investigators went to the area and discovered a crane junction and a crater nearby containing a damaged pipeline. This pipeline, part of the Siberia-Urals-Volga network, had experienced a gas leak. According to the original project plan, the pipeline was to be buried deep underground and kept at a safe distance from populated areas and railways. However, during construction, problems arose, and the pipeline was laid near the village of Srednye Kazyaki. To address this issue, pipeline workers took matters into their own hands, digging up the section on the western slope of Snake Mountain and laying it in a trench on the eastern slope. The new pipeline, 720 millimeters in diameter with 10 millimeter thick walls, was rated for 72 atmospheres of pressure. However, during these adjustments, the pipe was slightly damaged. This minor crack allowed gas to escape, which led to the catastrophic explosion. Without proper pressure testing, a mixture of liquefied hydrocarbon gases and heavier hydrocarbons was pumped into the new pipeline at 28 atmospheres. The gas began escaping through the crack, tearing the pipe apart. A dense gas cloud descended from Snake Mountain onto the railway. When the trains passed through this cloud, the gas-air mixture entered the engine, and a single spark was enough to trigger the devastating explosion. The investigation into the incident lasted 6 years. The workers who had rerouted the pipeline on their own initiative were found guilty. However, despite their actions resulting in the deaths of hundreds, they received minimal or suspended sentences. On October 24, 1960, a horrific disaster occurred at the Soviet Baikonur cosmodrome, marking the deadliest incident in the history of astronautics and rocket engineering. That day, an intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM, the R-16, was being prepared for launch. 15 minutes before the scheduled launch, an unauthorized ignition of the second stage engine occurred, destroying the first stage's fuel tanks and causing a catastrophic explosion of rocket fuel components. The exact number of casualties remains unknown to this day. Officially, 78 people were reported dead, but some estimates place the death toll at no fewer than 126. The Cold War era was marked by an arms race. The Soviet Union and the United States actively worked on new nuclear technology and space exploration projects. During this time, both nations opened spaceports and developed ballistic missiles and spacecraft. In 1955, the world's largest spaceport, Baikonur, was established in Kazakhstan. Just 5 years later, the site would witness the worst accident in rocket engineering history. By the late 1950s, the Soviet Union had 3 types of strategic missiles: the R-5, R-7, and R-12. However, these missiles lacked the range to strike the U.S. mainland. The range limitation of nuclear weapons became apparent immediately after their development. Meanwhile, the United States had a powerful fleet of strategic bombers and military bases near the Soviet Union's borders, providing them with the capability to strike enemy territory. The Soviet Union was forced to adopt a different strategy and began developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. On December 17, 1959, Chief Marshal of Artillery Mitrofan Ivanovich Nedelin was appointed the first Commander-in-Chief of the Strategic Rocket Forces. A month later, under the leadership of Soviet rocket engineer Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, the first ICBM, the R-7, was produced. The R-7 had a range of 8,000 kilometers and could reach U.S. territory. However, as the Soviet Union's first attempt at an ICBM, it had several shortcomings. The missile required extensive launch infrastructure, which was highly vulnerable to a preemptive nuclear strike, and its preparation for launch took an enormous amount of time, 32 hours. Moreover, the missile's cost was prohibitively high. Even Korolev himself argued that producing and deploying such a weapon was impractical due to its expense. By the late 1950s, the U.S. already had 40 operational ICBMs. This situation was unacceptable to the Soviet leadership, which pushed for improved missiles and successful test launches in the shortest possible time. This urgency contributed to the tragic Baikonur disaster. Given the limited time for developing and creating a new ICBM, the project of Soviet rocket engineer Mikhail Kuzmich Yangel was chosen. In 1956, Yangel proposed designing the R-16 ICBM using hypergolic propellants. This missile was more efficient than the R-7, but the Soviet government at the time hesitated to use highly toxic substances like unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide. Sergei Korolev also opposed such weapons, but due to time constraints, Yangel's project was approved. In 1960, the first R-16 missile was assembled and delivered from Dnipropetrovsk to Baikonur in September. Preparations for its testing began immediately, a process that was lengthy and labor-intensive. The preparations were personally overseen by Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, the first commander-in-chief of the Strategic Rocket Forces. Initial preparations went smoothly. On October 23rd, the missile was fueled with propellants and pressurized gas on Launch Pad 41. The launch was scheduled for the following day, October 24th, but a serious malfunction occurred. On the evening of October 23rd, after fueling was completed, defects in the detonation control panel led to the rupture of the second-stage oxidizer line's protective pyromembranes. Instead, the fuel line pyromembranes of the first stage burst. Minutes later, the pyro cartridges of the cutoff valves for the first-stage engine gas generator were spontaneously triggered. The root cause was a failure in the main power distributor. This malfunction was extremely serious, and the R-16 missile should not have been launched. It required the missile to be removed from the launch pad, its fuel drained, the engine disassembled, and the tanks and lines neutralized. This process would have taken a significant amount of time, which the Soviet Union could not afford. Consequently, a decision was made to replace the main distributor and the gas generator cutoff valves and proceed with the launch as planned. When Sergei Korolev learned of the situation, he warned Marshal Nedelin that launching a malfunctioning missile could lead to dire consequences. He also advised evacuating all non-essential personnel from the launch site. However, this recommendation was ignored. On the day of the launch, approximately 250 people were near the R-16 missile. The launch was scheduled for October 24th at 7 p.m. Military commanders and engineers were positioned in a specially equipped observation bunker designed to protect them in case of an explosion. Everyone eagerly awaited the missile's launch, but at 6:45 p.m., the unthinkable happened. The second-stage engine ignited spontaneously. This led to a fire, which burned through the oxidizer tank's base and then the first-stage fuel tank. In an instant, all 120 tons of rocket fuel ignited, resulting in a massive explosion. What followed was a nightmare. Waves of fire spread rapidly from the launch pad, consuming everything in their path. The explosive blaze lasted less than a minute, but it was enough for the fire to spread dozens of meters in all directions. Alongside the flames, fuel spilled from the missile's tanks. People standing near the missile were trapped in a fiery inferno and died instantly. Those farther away tried to escape, but fiery tornadoes and toxic fumes made it impossible. The fire at the launch pad continued for several hours after the rocket fuel had burned out. The temperature at the site was so high that even metal objects melted. According to official reports, 78 people lost their lives that day, but it is believed the actual number of casualties was much higher. Among the victims were Marshal Nedelin and Deputy Chairman of the State Committee of the Council of Ministers for Defense Technology, Lev Grishin. The R-16 missile's designer, Mikhail Yangel, narrowly escaped death. He had been at the launch site but had stepped away for a smoke shortly before the disaster. When the catastrophe occurred, he was in a designated smoking shelter away from the launch pad. Despite the severity of the incident and the significant loss of life, the tragedy was classified. The first mentions of the disaster appeared in Soviet media only in 1989. The investigative commission attributed the catastrophe to overconfidence in the safety of the entire complex. But ultimately, no one, not even Yangel, was held accountable. When satellites reach the end of their operational life, they are decommissioned. During deorbiting, they are remotely controlled to crash in a safe location, usually in the ocean. However, this is not always the case, as satellites can malfunction suddenly, rendering their propulsion systems uncontrollable. This is precisely what happened to the Soviet satellite Cosmos 954 in 1977, which fell onto Canadian territory. Although it landed in a remote area, seemingly harmless, the satellite was equipped with a nuclear power unit, making the incident far more concerning. During the Cold War, the arms race coincided with the space race. The leaders in both these fields were the Soviet Union and the United States. Neither country was certain about the future, but both were prepared for a sudden enemy attack. To guard against surprise attacks, the Soviet government ordered the construction of reconnaissance satellites to monitor enemy activity. The United States issued a similar directive. In 1958, American scientists began developing a satellite navigation system called Transit, which allowed not only the monitoring of hostile nations, but also the control of their own nuclear submarines armed with ballistic missiles. The first Soviet reconnaissance satellites were part of the Zenit series, with the first such satellite launched in 1961, though the mission failed. Space was a new frontier for advanced nations at the time, offering enormous possibilities. Consequently, satellites and other space technologies developed rapidly and were equipped with cutting-edge technology. On September 18, 1977, the Soviet satellite Cosmos 954 was launched from the Baikonur cosmodrome. It was the latest model in the Cosmos series, equipped with a BS-5 nuclear power system, codenamed Buk. The reactor operated on fast neutrons and had a thermal output of 100 kilowatts. Notably, this reactor remains the most compact in the world to date. Its fuel was highly enriched uranium, and its coolant was a potassium-sodium eutectic alloy with a melting point of -12.6 degrees Celsius. Unlike its predecessor Cosmos 367, Cosmos 954 was fully operational and successfully performed its functions. However, 40 days after its launch, the satellite malfunctioned and ceased to function. Control over Cosmos 954 was lost. Russian engineer and rocket and space technology specialist Alexander Zheleznikov spent years trying to determine why the Soviet satellite failed. While several theories were considered, he leans toward the idea that Cosmos 954 was shot down by American forces while over the Woomera test range in Australia. Regardless of the cause, the satellite was out of control, leaving its fate unpredictable. The world could only wait for the satellite to succumb to gravity and crash. Where it would fall remained a mystery, sparking global speculation. The descending Cosmos 954 instilled fear, not without reason. It was equipped with a nuclear reactor. On January 24, 1978, it was confirmed that the satellite had crashed in a remote area of northwestern Canada. While the uninhabited crash site was a relief, the situation was far from ideal. The satellite initially carried 37.1 kilograms of radioactive material. During its descent and passage through the atmosphere, most of this material was burned away, reducing the remaining amount to just a few dozen grams. However, the reactor remained intact, posing a significant threat to the crash site. The incident sparked heated debates. The Soviet Union insisted that the nuclear power unit met international standards and could not cause severe consequences even in the event of an accident. Meanwhile, the US government disagreed, accusing the USSR of a deliberate attack on Canada. The day after the crash, the United States and Canada launched a joint operation to locate the debris. The Soviet Union offered to assist in the effort, but the offer was declined. Ultimately, 100 pieces of satellite debris weighing 65 kilograms were found in the remote northwestern Canadian wilderness. Their radioactivity levels ranged from a few milliroentgens per hour to 200 roentgens. The commission concluded that approximately 100 square kilometers of land had been contaminated. However, the radioactive contamination was minimal, as only a few grams of radioactive material had reached the ground. Despite the relatively low environmental impact, the fact that debris containing a nuclear reactor fell on one of the world's largest countries caused a prolonged scandal. The media widely reported on the incident, portraying it as one of the largest man-made disasters. However, this characterization was exaggerated. After extensive disputes among Canada, the United States, and the Soviet Union, the United Nations issued a document titled Settlement of Canada's Claims Against the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics for Damage Caused by the Satellite Cosmos 954. According to the agreement, the Soviet government was to pay compensation of over 6 million Canadian dollars. The USSR agreed to pay only 3 million Canadian dollars, but the final amount of the settlement remains unknown. In August 1994, Russia experienced a devastating man-made disaster in the Komi Republic. On that day, a pipeline rupture at the Vosges oil pipeline released hundreds of thousands of tons of oil into the environment. This catastrophe entered the Guinness Book of World Records as the largest oil spill in human history. The consequences of this incident had a profound negative impact on the planet's ecology, and it took more than 15 years to mitigate them. Undoubtedly, if the accident had been noticed and resolved immediately, its scale would have been far smaller. This story highlights the irresponsibility and negligence of the workers and managers of the oil pipeline. In 1971, a multi-layered light oil deposit was discovered near the village of Vosges, 55 kilometers from the city of Usinsk in the Komi Republic. 4 years later, the Vosges Interfield oil pipeline was constructed at the site, and 3 years after that, under the management of Comineft, oil production began. The story of the Usinsk disaster begins with the initial technical decisions. It was decided to launch the pipeline without a dedicated oil processing facility, a complex used to receive, separate, and process crude oil. Although such a facility was eventually built in 1978, it was located near Usinsk rather than Vosges. The second major oversight by the Comineft management was their lack of attention to the technical specifics of the pipeline. It was designed to transport processed oil with low corrosive activity, but instead, it was used to pump highly corrosive oil-containing liquids. During the early years of operation, everything ran smoothly, and the pipeline became part of the larger Karyaga-Usa oil pipeline system. Oil volumes increased significantly, but the crude oil from the Karyaga field contained highly corrosive gases and a high paraffin content. As mentioned earlier, the pipeline was not designed for highly corrosive oil, and problems quickly arose. In 1988, the first hole appeared in the pipeline, releasing at least 15 tons of oil into the environment. The spill was quickly resolved, but an inspection revealed active internal corrosion in the pipeline, shortening its lifespan. An official report, still available online, stated that the pipeline's operational life would be about 20 months before a major disaster became inevitable. Clearly, action was needed. The oil supply should have been temporarily halted, the pipeline replaced, and only appropriate crude transported. However, these measures required time and money, which were not readily available. Instead, Comineft management planned a series of protective measures for the pipeline. Of these, only a few were implemented. Corrosion inhibitors were periodically injected into the pipeline, and 2 cathodic protection systems were installed, both of which failed within months. These measures did little to solve the problem, and new leaks followed. Between 1989 and 1994, at least 30 oil leaks occurred. These were not reported in the news. Workers simply patched the pipeline and continued operations. However, this could not go on indefinitely. By August 1994, the pipeline had over 32 leaks, continuously releasing oil. Official reports claim that nearly 79,000 tons of oil leaked into the environment over 3 months when the incident was ignored. Experts, however, estimate that this figure is understated by at least 3 times. The spill affected a minimum area of 79 hectares, with oil layers reaching up to 1 meter thick in some places. The Kolva River suffered the most from the contamination, which then spread to the USA and Pechora rivers. Some oil film traveled via the Pechora River to the Barents Sea, with elevated oil concentrations detected as far as the Norwegian coast. The leak from the Vosges pipeline might have continued indefinitely if not for media coverage of the disaster by international outlets. Finally, on October 26, 1994, a Ministry of Emergency Situations Commission arrived at the site, and on November 2nd, the Russian prosecutor's office launched a criminal investigation, initially opened by the Usinsk prosecutor in September. The investigation revealed many details about the disaster. In August 1994, Komeneft attempted to address the consequences of the catastrophe independently, forming a task force. However, their efforts were limited to patching pipeline holes, despite having sufficient funds for proper repairs. The investigation uncovered the 1988 report after the first spill, further confirming Komeneft's negligence. Ignoring the incident was no longer an option. The decision was made to eliminate the consequences and build a new pipeline. The Russian government allocated $12 million for this purpose, while the World Bank and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development provided a $124 million loan. The cleanup and land reclamation process concluded in 2010. Over the years, at least 470 cubic meters of contaminated soil, oil, and oil water emulsions were collected. The affected area has since been removed from the status of an ecological disaster zone. However, due to Komeneft's negligence, an irreversible blow was dealt to the planet's environment. In the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler ordered the development of various types of weapons. Scientists began working on their projects, hoping to create weapons that would help the Third Reich conquer the world. In 1939, Professor Paul Hartek from the University of Hamburg informed the German Armed Forces leadership that he and his colleagues had succeeded in splitting uranium atoms. This breakthrough opened up new possibilities for the Wehrmacht, particularly in creating nuclear reactors and atomic bombs. Hartek's idea was approved. In September of the same year, a program called the Uranium Project was initiated. The top physicists in Germany were tasked with this secret project. Across the country, over 20 organizations were established to work on the Uranium Project, with the most prominent being the Physical Chemistry Institute at the University of Leipzig. This institute was home to Nobel laureate Werner Karl Heisenberg, one of the creators of quantum mechanics, who led the project. Over 3 years, scientists worked on the project, aiming to create a reactor capable of producing plutonium. In late 1940, Heisenberg faced setbacks during nuclear experiments. After identifying the issues, he improved the design for the next reactor. It was decided to use uranium powder as fuel and heavy water as a moderator. Manufacturers for these materials had to be identified. Uranium was primarily supplied by the Degussa Company, while heavy water production took place in Norway. By late 1941, the L3 project was completed. However, during reactor testing, the uranium powder ignited. Even after extinguishing the fire, the uranium continued to smolder, which could only be stopped with water. Following this incident, Heisenberg revised uranium handling and safety protocols, and together with his colleagues, proceeded with the next design. In February 1942, Werner Karl Heisenberg, Georg Robert Doppel, and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker jointly developed the first nuclear reactor, named L4, at the Leipzig Institute. The reactor consisted of 2 aluminum hemispheres containing 572 kilograms of uranium powder, 140 kilograms of heavy water, and a neutron initiator made from a radium-beryllium primary neutron source. Tests of the L4 reactor showed that the design could sustain nuclear fission reactions. This discovery was a breakthrough in nuclear physics. The results were published in a classified Nazi nuclear program journal. It seemed that Germany's dream of developing powerful weapons capable of world domination was becoming a reality. But on June 23, 1943, an event occurred that changed the Wehrmacht's plans. On that day, scientists decided to check L4 for potential heavy water leaks. During testing, bubbles began to emerge from the reactor, which had been submerged in a water tank for 20 days. Georg Doppel decided to analyze the bubbles and discovered hydrogen, indicating that a leak had occurred, causing uranium to react with water. After some time, the bubbles disappeared. Despite this, Doppel ordered the reactor to be removed from the tank to determine how much water had entered. An assistant loosened the cap on a fitting, and then something terrifying happened. Noise erupted from inside the reactor, and moments later a crack appeared, releasing red-hot uranium powder and starting a fire. After the fire was extinguished, Doppel ordered the reactor to be placed back into the water tank, opened, and the heavy water to be drained immediately. However, this turned out to be a grave mistake. A true catastrophe followed, becoming the first nuclear accident in human history. Air entered the reactor, and the uranium powder heated the surrounding water, creating critical steam pressure. The reactor's temperature rose to 1,000 degrees Celsius. Understanding the severity of the situation, the scientists quickly evacuated the laboratory. A powerful explosion soon occurred inside the facility. Streams of burning uranium scattered, engulfing the building in flames. Fortunately, no one was killed, but the laboratory was nearly destroyed, and all uranium and heavy water supplies were lost. The accident raised many questions, including why, after the failure of the L3 reactor, Heisenberg continued to use uranium powder despite its properties. Heisenberg seemed to have believed that as the reactor heated up, the resonance absorption of neutrons by uranium-238 would significantly increase. However, he overlooked the fact that heavy water had negligible resonance absorption of fast neutrons from uranium-238. Another mystery lies in why Heisenberg didn't use control rods in his reactors, which rendered these hazardous constructions completely uncontrollable. Heisenberg wasn't the only scientist leading Germany's nuclear programs, but all other projects also relied on heavy water moderators and ended in failure. Meanwhile, on December 2, 1942, Enrico Fermi successfully completed a reactor in Chicago that used graphite as a moderator, achieving the first self-sustaining chain reaction. Yet, German scientists persisted with heavy water experiments. This miscalculation and stubbornness ultimately deprived Adolf Hitler of the opportunity to develop an atomic bomb during World War II. And that's all for this story. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Your engagement is the best reward for me. Thank you for watching and see you soon. Goodbye.